Night, December 1943. Somewhere above the silver clouds over western Germany, the world is black glass and frost. The engines of a B-17 vibrate the airframe with mechanical rhythm, 4 deep pulses lost in the roar of wind. Inside the cabin, the air is thin, the temperature a killing chill. Breath freezes on oxygen masks. Below, the Rhine glimmers faintly, fractured by the intermittent light of flares and braking artillery. Then, through the hiss of static, a sound emerges. Soft at first, a melody. Brass and strings carried over radio waves not meant to be heard here. The crew glances at one another. It's an American tune, something that once played in diners and ballrooms before the war. The radio man frowns. This frequency isn't theirs. Far below, in a ground station of the Luftwaffe Night Fighter Corps, a technician's headphones quiver with the same song. His pencil stops. He marks a direction bearing and summons an officer. Within seconds, other stations begin to capture it, triangulating their positions. The sound that should have comforted now betrays. Above the frozen darkness, pilots and ground controllers move to strike, guided not by radar, but by music, and it began only with a song. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had turned into a contest of endurance and ingenuity. The Allies, convinced that strategic bombing could break the industrial spine of the Reich, launched waves of daylight raids deep into enemy territory. The Royal Air Force struck by night, draped in shadow, while the United States Army Air Forces braved daylight skies in tight bomber formations meant to protect one another through massed defensive fire. Every mission demanded precision and coordination, measured not just in miles, but in the invisible weave of frequencies. Radios were the arteries of survival. From ground control to flight leader, from gunners to escort fighters slicing through contrails several thousand feet below. In the flight deck of a B-17, a single misstep on the transmitter dial could expose the position of an entire squadron. Radio discipline was drilled into crews as fiercely as gunnery itself. Yet, as the technology advanced, so did the orchestra of competing signals filling Europe's airspace. Navigation beacons, radar pings, jammers, coded transmissions, propaganda broadcasts, and even morale programs meant to lift soldiers' spirits all pulsed through the ether. In this dense electronic fog, mistakes could travel farther than bullets. Germany's response was both meticulous and formidable. The Luftwaffe's night fighter defense system, known as the Kammhuber line, after its architect, General Joseph Kammhuber, divided the night sky into radar-covered zones called Himmelbett, or canopy beds. Each sector was coordinated with radar, searchlights, and twin-engine fighters equipped with airborne intercept radar. To feed this electronic web, German intelligence monitored Allied frequencies around the clock. Specialist listening units, attached to signals intelligence networks like Funkaufklärung der Luftwaffe, mapped transmissions, logged call signs, and learned to identify the fingerprints of Allied formations simply by sound patterns. For every bomb released, for every coded word whispered, there was a possibility of being overheard. In England, the American 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe oversaw a growing armada, hundreds of heavy bombers departing in staggered waves across the North Sea. By the end of 1943, their presence in the skies was constant, but so too was their vulnerability. German detection units tracked radio chatter, navigation signals from bomber beacons, and even radar emissions from the bombers' tail warning systems. As the Allies improved radar jamming, the Germans shifted focus to human error, monitoring casual transmissions, broken encryptions, and stray sounds that pierced the disciplined silence. The broader environment was no quieter on the home front. The Armed Forces Radio Service, created in 1942, sought to deliver a sound from home to troops spread across the globe. Big band music, comedy programs, and uplifting words were transmitted across high-frequency bands, accessible even in faraway outposts. For men shivering in crash huts of East Anglia or waiting in foxholes in Italy, these spirited broadcasts felt like proof that life still existed beyond the war. Yet those same broadcasts sometimes shared boundaries with operational channels when atmospheric conditions bent frequencies into strange paths. This blending of morale and warfare, signals of comfort mixing with signals of combat, made accidents inevitable. In the winter months, atmospheric reflections over continental Europe became unpredictable. Frequencies bounced off cold layers of air, skipping hundreds of miles from their intended targets. A cheerful broadcast from London might echo faintly over the Rhineland, landing directly in the range of German interception posts. Essentially, Allied voices spoke into enemy ears, and so the invisible war became personal. Radio operators carried lists of forbidden words. Pilots memorized frequencies as sacred codes. Instructors warned that careless transmissions could kill comrades they couldn't even see. Yet beneath the monotone of static and the endless roar of engines, fatigue eroded vigilance. Men half frozen at 20,000 feet might adjust a dial wrongly or stare too long at the green pulse of a radar screen. Lulled by routine, in that margin of error, that thin band of confusion between communication and exposure, entire squadrons faced annihilation. And it was within that fraught, humming atmosphere of December 1943 that a melody escaped its tether, traveling from the cheer of an American studio across the icy night into ears that were never supposed to hear it. On the ground, Germany had developed a formidable ear for the sky. The night fighter defense network did not rely on radar alone. Scattered across occupied Europe were the wooden shacks and antenna farms of Horknets, the Luftwaffe's listening web. There, German technicians, young men hardened by tedium more than gunfire, wore out their hearing detecting Allied signals that might last mere seconds. Every hum, pulse, or background tone was logged and mapped. A few seconds of chatter might reveal altitude, heading, and even unit type. When the Allies refined radar jamming, forcing German operators into uncertainty, these listeners turned their focus to the murmur of Allied radio discipline. They noted accents, patterns, and even the musicality of Morse code keys. Over time, an entire linguistic fingerprint of the American 8th Air Force was built from hundreds of intercepted fragments. German night fighter operations drew on this intelligence with lethal efficiency. When bombers crossed the Dutch coast, radar stations fed bearings to command posts, Jagdleitstände, which guided Messerschmitt Bf 110s and Junkers Ju-88s into position. In the blackness, the pursuing aircraft hunted by sound and instruction, often without ever seeing the enemy's lights until tracers tore the night open. Communication discipline determined who would live to see dawn. Inside Bomber Command, the threat was understood but never fully tamed. Each radio transmission on the Allied side had to be minimal, strictly coded and timed. Yet not all frequencies were under military seal. The Armed Forces Radio Network, originating from England, North Africa, and eventually Italy, used mid-wave and short-wave bands sometimes susceptible to what engineers called atmospheric skip. Under certain temperature layers, a wave might reflect down thousands of miles from its intended path. London's cheerful midnight broadcast of swing music could easily resurface on a Luftwaffe intercept operator's receiver hundreds of kilometers away. Such anomalies had already caused smaller incidents. In 1942, near the Bay of Biscay, a British coastal command unit was briefly misled when its navigation set confused a music broadcast for a homing beacon. Later in 1943, reports surfaced of isolated German fighters seemingly waiting at predicted interception points, suggesting Allied transmissions were leaking positions through unintended harmonics or duplicated frequencies. Although Allied commanders investigated, they often found such errors too rare, too subtle to prevent entirely. The war of frequencies had become an unpredictable dance of science and chance. At the heart of it were humans, operators, switchboard clerks, and studio engineers, improvising under pressure. In the London studios of the Armed Forces Radio Service, shows were often cut live and transmitted to uplink sites connected to shortwave towers. Wartime London was jittery and overworked. There were occasional signal overlaps, mislabeled relay lines, or equipment drift caused by generator fluctuations or bomb damage. A song meant for 16 kilohertz could spill across to a neighboring band used for tactical updates. It was the sonic equivalent of an aircraft drifting off course by a few degrees, barely noticeable but disastrous under moonlight. The Germans, meanwhile, grew ever more confident in their ability to listen. Captain Friedrich Wenck, a radio specialist in the Luftnachrichtenwesen, Air Signals Service, once wrote in a report that every careless broadcast is a light in the night sky. Listening to enemy frequencies had become, for them, a daily act of patience, as essential as refueling or arming the aircraft. As 1943 drew to a close, the Allied bombing offensive reached a critical point. Brutal losses over Schweinfurt and Regensburg had ravaged bomber crews. The Americans pushed for tighter formations, new electronic countermeasures, and even radar-guided pathfinders. The Germans, stretched thin yet still meticulous, relied on what they called Zame Sau tactics, tame bore, in which night fighters were vectored by ground control to intercept Allied bomb streams detected by radio or radar. Anything that betrayed a bomber's approach, engine noise, radar emission, or in this peculiar case, a broadcast melody, was a weapon unto itself. By the winter of 1943, both sides had transformed the air into a vast, invisible battlefield, alive with noise and fear. What was once an instrument of communication had become a double-edged sword. And then, amid that layered hum of war, a signal meant to soothe loneliness, an ordinary American tune, would cut a path through the darkness, carrying not solace but doom. Every story in war reveals itself through layers: technology, human endurance, command discipline, and the unseen moral texture that holds them together. The incident that would later be remembered simply as the song interception offers each of these views, like lights flickering briefly in fog. Up in the bombers, men lived by rhythm. The constant vibration of engines, the crackle of the intercom, the ritual shrug of frozen shoulders before a mission. Radio operators were often forgotten figures in war films. Quiet, bespectacled, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by dials that glowed dull green in the night. But theirs was the heartbeat of every flight. Over years of flying, fatigue set in like rust. Missions stretched late into the night. Each operator learned to identify weather, distance, and even morale by the tone of a radio voice. The sky became a warehouse of anonymous souls speaking across frequencies. Against that tense backdrop, a faint tune slipping through static created not alarm at first, but nostalgia. For an instant, men listened. It was music from home, the sound of Friday nights before the draft. That human response, that instinct to recognize and to feel before analyzing, was both poignant and fatal. In the glass womb of the bomber, emotion defeated vigilance for only a few seconds. But in an environment where seconds determined survival, that pause mattered. The men aboard those bombers, and the Germans listening below, were participants in the same tragic theater of sound. World War II was a war of frequencies. Every signal had a signature. The armed forces radio broadcast chain relied on high-frequency transmitters powerful enough to cross oceans. When a broadcast hopped off the upper atmosphere, a process known as skywave reflection, its reach was unpredictable. Engineers could plan for coverage zones, but temperature gradients, magnetic solar activity, and even the time of night could change everything. German signals intelligence had mastered the art of exploiting this unpredictability. Their Corps NBV-2 signal battalions deployed mobile tracking equipment along the Belgian and Dutch coasts. Using overlapping directional antennas, they could triangulate a source within minutes. Once a bearing was established, information flowed quickly by encrypted landline to Jagdleitstände, command centers where controllers guided fighters by radio telephone. To Allied engineers, it was an imperfect but manageable threat. To German operators, it was an opportunity. When the melody surfaced, their instruments registered a clear, steady carrier wave strong enough to fix. For direction finders, a constant audio transmission, especially one as distinctive as music, was a gift. Voice comms flickered and faded. Singing stayed continuous. The song rendered the invisible visible. Numbers and bearings began to align. A faint warmth in the metal coils of equipment marked the sudden purpose of the machinery. The air had betrayed its secret. Technology meant finally to humanize the solitude of war, instead wired men directly to destruction. Few accounts describe the mindset of the German operators that winter. Many were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They worked indoors, surrounded by vacuum tubes, shuffling papers and maps riddled with pushpins. It was a bureaucratic war, but one that required acute attention. Interceptors' new Allied radio discipline was tightening. They recorded and analyzed leakages primarily for command strategists in Berlin, not expecting many direct tactical rewards. So when a fragment of American music arrived across channels used by bomber command frequencies, curiosity turned instantly into urgency. An officer authorized a triangulation sweep. Luftwaffe night fighter pilots, listening over auxiliary receivers, quickly recognized an unusual signal cutting through background noise. Training taught them that consistency meant proximity. The source could not be far beyond the horizon if the wavelength was that clear. "Lock in and confirm," came the calm procedural orders from the ground. For a moment there was silence in the control room. The breath held stillness before a calculation's truth appeared. Then multiple bearings intersected. The target was high, northwest, moving slowly in formation. Fighters scrambled without needing visual confirmation. And in those rotating beams of coordination, fear appeared not among the Germans but deep within their discipline. Because to hear the enemy's pulse so plainly, to listen to their music at home, was to glimpse a humanity they were trained to forget. Reports later noted the unease it caused. Pilots spoke of the eerie unreality of chasing a melody into the dark. War's normal physics had collapsed. They were hunting sound. This triangle of human frailty, radio precision, and enemy fascination formed the architecture of that night's catastrophe. While Allied crews flew unaware and German pilots rose into the frozen clouds, the air itself sang a signal neither side wished to claim. And within that strange mixture of technology and emotion, the deeper motives of command would soon collide. The discipline, leadership, and moral tension that decided how both sides faced what came after. In the war rooms of High Wycombe and in field command posts across occupied Europe, leadership hinged on control, not only of men but of voices. Commanders on both sides lived in perpetual fear of chaos creeping through the radio ether. The rules were explicit: brevity, encryption, and timing. Word lists were rehearsed, and protocols were recited until they were mechanical. Yet the fragile line between discipline and impulse often faltered under pressure. For the Allied High Command, radio silence was sacred during major operations. American bomber crews were drilled on shorthand transmission codes, their call signs changing daily. Even so, routine breeds complacency. A tone out of place, a slang phrase, or the wrong song drifting across a band could reveal more than any spy. When the accidental broadcast occurred, the hierarchy trembled under embarrassment. Officers at both the Armed Forces Radio Studio in London and the Communications Branch traced paperwork, desperate to identify what had gone wrong. It was not a traitor, only an error invisible until too late. The Germans, by contrast, took pride in order. Their radio discipline was militarized to obsession. But discipline without compassion hardened men into brittle instruments. Some Luftwaffe controllers hesitated that night when they realized what they were tracing. The object, the music, was too articulate, too human. "Engage regardless," came the order. Duty outweighed discomfort. Mistakes were permitted in no direction. Beneath the cold precision of command, there was another kind of terror, the fear of failing one's own rigid system. That tension, the Americans struggling to maintain freedom under discipline, the Germans surrendering warmth for procedure, defined the conflict more broadly. Each mistake in communication mirrored the moral weight of command decisions far from any cockpit. Even in silence, leadership bore the sound of consequences. War compresses emotions into signals and habits, yet a melody possesses the power to reopen every suppressed feeling. When the music surfaced across the combat frequencies, it pierced both sides differently. For the Americans, it was ghostly comfort. For the Germans, it was recognition of their enemy's realness. Diary fragments from soldiers, later collected after the war, describe similar moments when broadcasts blurred enemy boundaries. German youth familiar with swing had secretly tuned in to Allied radio before such listening became punishable. For them, the idea that American rhythms were now audible through military channels was almost metaphysical. The home front sound of the enemy had entered the operational heart of the Reich. Pilots later recounted the unsettling beauty of it. It was as if the enemy spoke softly before he was seen, one wrote, years after captivity. For the Allied crews, fear followed realization. The moment they noticed the Luftwaffe adjusting, converging with uncanny precision, the comfort of the song collapsed into blame. Music had always been morale's oxygen. Suddenly, it was a vector of death. Afterward, survivors spoke of hearing melodies differently, as though every tune carried static beneath it. Psychologically, the event stripped war of abstraction. Men realized that technology could not protect them from human error, that comfort could betray, and that voices once meant to sustain life could invite attack. Historians later interpreted that night as a parable. Humanity's tools of solace transformed into its instruments of exposure. Militarily, the incident highlighted the fragility of communications control. The Luftwaffe's success that night confirmed the efficacy of triangulation even against powerful adversaries. Interception relied not on strength but precision. Even a cheerful broadcast could become directional data. The German detection network moved with almost orchestral timing. Within 5 minutes of the melody's appearance, 3 intercept stations logged bearings. Within 10 minutes, instructions had been transmitted to night fighter controllers, who calculated the projected course of the bomber stream. Radar contact soon confirmed what the ears of German technicians had predicted purely by sound. Such efficiency symbolized the maturity of wartime signals intelligence. For the Allies, the reaction was swift. The 8th Air Force Communications Division ordered a full review of overlapping frequencies between entertainment and tactical systems. Lists of restricted broadcast hours were drawn up. Future morale transmissions were given dedicated wavelengths isolated from combat operations. Engineers implemented frequency locking devices to prevent drift. The once romantic spontaneity of radio gave way to procedural exactness. From an operational standpoint, few mistakes contained more teaching value. The lesson was brutal but measurable. Control the airwaves or lose the night. The radio, that symbol of modern connection, now demanded a ritual of silence. Yet for the men who had watched tracers bloom over the horizon, who had felt engines shudder as comrades vanished into darkness, it was not electronics they remembered. It was a song, the senseless perfection of a tune that bridged continents and then betrayed them. That was the paradox of total war, that the same humanity that invented radio to speak and sing could twist it into a weapon of detection. From those frequencies of accident and purpose would rise the conflict's turning points, moments where the sky burned, because sound itself had faltered, and the cold night of December 1943 was about to reach one such turning point, the precise second when that melody guided steel teeth into formation. The night of December 22, 1943, arrived with clear skies and the kind of still air that amplifies sound. To the Americans of the 96th Bomb Group, based at Snetterton Heath in England, the mission was to hit the rail marshalling yards near Münster. It was routine by the standards of that winter. Another long haul into the heart of Germany, another gamble against searchlights and flak. The crews performed their rituals, coffee in tin mugs, pre-flight checks by torchlight, and the metallic clatter of oxygen connectors snapping home. Shortly before midnight, 21 heavy bombers climbed eastward into the numbing stratosphere. Above 20,000 feet, eyes watered freely, and hydraulic lines froze despite insulation. Radios hissed with life, then fell silent as orders demanded operational radio blackout. At that same hour, hundreds of miles away, a warm glow filled an underground studio beneath London's Piccadilly Circus. It was an armed forces radio service broadcast, a morale segment for troops stationed in England and North Africa. The technicians, tired but cheerful, queued up a popular American swing piece, one known across the Atlantic for its bright optimism. The engineer adjusted the transmitter array. He checked the dials for band alignment, unaware that the atmospheric conditions that night were betraying him. A cold layer above the channel turned the radio waves into mirrors. Instead of curving gently toward Allied receivers, the signal ricocheted high and far, riding the stratosphere, leaping far over Belgium, and bleeding softly into frequencies monitored by Luftwaffe ground stations near Düsseldorf and Essen. At 1:47 hours, a German signals officer at Flugmeldeleitstelle Barmen noticed something peculiar. Among the usual Allied navigational buzz, an unusual clarity cut through the static. Orchestral music, steady, bright. He called the duty officer, who recognized it immediately as foreign. Within minutes, other listening posts confirmed identical reception. The bearing intersected over the Ruhr Valley, and crucially, toward a known route used by American bomber streams entering central Germany. The realization came with a jolt of electricity through the command center. This wasn't propaganda, measurement, or Morse. This was a continuous tone strong enough for perfect triangulation. Luftwaffe controllers responded with textbook precision. The Zahme-Sau protocol was initiated. Orders crackled down wired lines. At Venlo, Night Fighter Wing Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 began engine warm-up. Twin-engine Bf-110s and Ju-88s lined the runway, exhaust shimmering in the frost. Ground control began feeding headings calculated directly from the music's source. And still it played. Swing tunes rolling effortlessly across enemy airspace, the melody skipping along the invisible highways of ionized air. In the bombers, thousands of feet higher still, the crews, unaware of their strange broadcast companions, began to pick up faint signals, the eerie trace of a transmission on an adjacent channel. Most assumed it was ground interference. No aircraft altered its path. They pressed on, instruments glowing, the steady rhythm of propellers masking the world's shifting geometry around them. Below, radar operators plotted ghosts. With every passing minute of the song, the network closed in tighter. The stations at Münster and Hamm fed their bearings to the Jagd Division headquarters. An overlapping zone emerged, precisely along the expected bomber corridor. Fighters took to the sky. Captain Heinrich Plocher of NJG-1 would later recall in post-war interviews that it was the cleanest fix we ever had. The music, constant and unwavering, allowed them to navigate without radar's uncertainty. He called it chasing light made of sound. At approximately 01:05 hours, the first German aircraft encountered the bomber stream northwest of Essen. Gunfire flared across the clouds. Tracers soared through vapor trails like fiery beads on thread. The sky erupted with cannon flashes, explosions blooming faintly through thin cloud banks. The American formation, compressed tight for defense, suddenly faced an enemy whose timing seemed near supernatural. The attacking fighters materialized from the darkness as if guided by foresight. To the bewildered gunners, it looked as though the Luftwaffe had read their minds. They had not only their frequencies. In minutes, 2 B-17s vanished in bursts of light. Lifeboats and gear scattered through the dark air. At 01:12, another formation broke apart under heavy fire. Pilots shouted partial coordinates, overwhelmed by interference. Some tried switching frequencies, but the chaos rendered all signals tangled. The radio operator aboard one surviving craft noted afterward, "Voice channels filled with melody and panic. I couldn't tell them apart." Above the burning countryside, among the drifting wreckage, even the German pilots later claimed they could still faintly hear it. The same cheerful tune, leaking through headphones, hovering over static and screams. By the time the broadcast faded from reception, 9 American bombers were gone. A finger's width of wavelength had opened a chasm in the night. And though the gunfire subsided, the resonance of that song lingered in every cockpit. A reminder that no one controlled the air, only borrowed it. The second half of this climax would stretch into the balance of night. Pursuit, confusion, and stunned comprehension among those who survived to see dawn. The battle expanded like a storm front. What began as a single bearing crossed with uncanny precision became a hunt measured in fragments of sound, silhouettes against flame, and the nervous pulse of men watching their instruments turn red. At 01:18 hours, radar operators east of Duisburg confirmed retreating dots, the bomber stream fracturing under coordinated attack. Night fighters, directed by JAG Division 2, were feeding on positions derived from the fading echo of that misplaced broadcast. Even after the music stopped, the plotted bearings remained solid enough to sustain pursuit. For 20 additional minutes, the Germans fought not blind, but enlightened. Where normally radar interference, altitude confusion, and cloud disruption thwarted them, that night every correction felt uncanny in its accuracy. Lieutenant Kurt Braddock's Ju-88 intercepted a straggler by pure guidance from ground control. His radio logs, later recovered, recorded the command center's words: altitude, bearing, and identification, all eerily aligned. The lost song had revealed the pattern of the bomber corridor itself. For the American crews, confusion deepened. Reports poured over the intercoms of fighters appearing where none should be. Gunners scanned darkness split by arcs of tracer light. Navigators misidentified constellations through turbulence. Veterans said later the night looked stitched in fire. By 01:30 hours, defensive formations broke apart to minimize losses. What had been a massive fortress of metal will degrade into desperate individual climbs and dives. The radios, meant to coordinate retreat, filled instead with fractured words and silence. The radio blackout orders made any transmission dangerous, yet silence offered no salvation. Without coordination, returning to England meant navigating through bomb craters in the measureless dark. The Luftwaffe exploited this fragmentation expertly. Each fighter, guided by ground control's relayed bearings, tuned for bomber engine noise using Naxos ZR detectors designed to track Allied radar emissions. The precarious intersection of analog signals, the same chaotic ether that hosted the fateful song, now became a landscape of overlapping ghosts. Inside one stricken B-17, the radio man tried to hail friendly frequencies. Instead, he heard a whisper of harmony, an echo of the tune still lingering from atmospheric reflection. It mingled with static and engine moans, the entire cabin vibrating as tracer rounds whipped past. He later wrote, "It sounded like home admiring our destruction." Minutes later, his aircraft was hit and lost among the clouds. German accounts paint no celebration. Many pilots described unease rather than triumph. They were trained to intercept instruments, but here they had followed a melody, something human, not mechanical. Between missions, they had been indoctrinated to view the bombers as faceless machines raining chaos upon Germany. Hearing that music undid some of that. We felt them close, like neighbors with whom we would never speak, one radio controller recalled in post-war testimony. At WWII, the surviving bombers crossed back over the Rhine, battered but intact enough to limp home. The night fighters turned back, short on fuel. As they landed on frost-glazed runways, ground crew moved silently among them, counting ammunition and marking damaged fuselages. Reports went up the chain with clinical precision. 9 kills confirmed, several probable. No mention of melody, only radio anomaly exploited successfully. Hours later, with dawn rising dull and bruised across East Anglia, what remained of the bomber stream stumbled homeward. Engines coughed black smoke over the white English fields. Runway crews counted the missing. Commanders reviewed debriefs in silence and disbelief. How could German fighters have located them so quickly, so accurately, before any radar contact should have been possible? By afternoon, Allied signals analysts in London picked through logs, realizing the coincidence. At almost the same moment the interception began, a live morale broadcast had gone out on a frequency dangerously near operational bands. The transmitter was eventually traced. Its officer wept when shown the data. He had no way of knowing the atmospheric conditions would scatter the signal into enemy territory. Some nights, he would later say, the air simply disobeys you. For the rest of that week, radio operators across Bomber Command received revamped instructions, double-checking crystal calibrations, aligning frequency locks, and monitoring even entertainment transmissions for spectral leakage. It was an invisible sealing of wounds. Yet, for crews who had survived, the correction did little to quell the paranoia that settled permanently into their habits. Every hiss of interference became a potential threat. Every song sounded treacherous. Among the Luftwaffe, the event was studied with academic detachment. Reports circulated in intelligence circles about radiophonischer Zufallserfolg, a radiophonic accidental success. They understood it was unlikely to repeat. But psychologically, it offered immense consolation, proof that vigilance and listening could beat force and numbers. For a moment, the Reich's defenders had turned the enemy's culture, the very emblem of its morale, into a weapon. As darkness fell again that next evening, another air raid siren wailed through the streets of Bremen. Civilians paused, remembering the destruction that had plagued their nights for months. Overhead, the sky filled with contrails again, indifferent to yesterday's tragedy. Yet for those who had heard that American tune spill through static, its echo became inseparable from the smell of cordite and the flare of tracers. The battle was now over. What remained were questions that no radar or statistic could answer. How could music, designed to heal, become a vector of war's coldest precision? How many workers loading bombs that morning ever thought they might die listening to trumpets, not sirens? Beyond the smoke, dawn rose weakly across ruined train yards and blackened farms. And out of that gray light came the reckoning. The tally, the consequence, and the long, grim silence that followed. When morning came, the English airfields were lined with flame-scarred metal. Ground crews moved among the returning aircraft, counting the missing spaces between their rows like missing teeth in a once bright grin. 9 B-17s had not come back. Dozens more limped home, shredded by cannon fire. In the quiet aftermath, the only sound was that of engines dying, propeller blades winding down into stillness. The debriefing officers of the 8th Air Force faced a room of hollow-eyed men. Nobody yet understood what had gone wrong. Navigation logs were correct. Radar jamming had worked as expected. Flak belts had been predictable. And still the Luftwaffe had appeared in their path before radar warning was possible. "They were already waiting," one pilot whispered, shell-shocked, as if they'd been told where to be. Word of the accidental broadcast filtered in by late afternoon. A London monitor station, reviewing high-frequency interference records, noted a spike on an overlapping channel at roughly the moment the interception occurred. The correlation was undeniable. The Morse transmission, cheerful and ordinary, had skipped across the sky into German receivers. Atmospheric data confirmed the reflection layer that night had been unusually strong, bending the signal toward the Ruhr Valley at the precise hour of the mission. The investigation read like a cruel paradox. The music had been played to strengthen resolve. Instead, it had exposed fragility. Reports circulated through command. Unauthorized frequency proximity event. Estimated enemy exploitation window, 22 minutes. The phrase was bureaucratic and bloodless, a defense against the reality that a few bars of melody had cost nearly 100 American lives. The radio engineer responsible for that night's Armed Forces broadcast, exhausted, conscientious, anonymous, was inconsolable. His error wasn't criminal. Calibration had been accurate when measured. Nature itself had misbehaved. Ionospheric reflection ignores human scheduling. But guilt respects no technicality. He reportedly refused further on-air work, finishing the war in a maintenance post. At High Wycombe headquarters, communications officers responded with immediate procedural reform. Entertainment networks would henceforth transmit only on frequencies at least 20 kHz removed from any operational band. A new directive, Circular 198-44, demanded dual authentication before activation of any high-frequency transmitter within the British theater. Command discipline became absolute. For the crews, though, technical corrections could not erase the dread that crept into routine. Superstition took hold. Some radio men refused to carry personal music records aloft, fearing bad luck. Others joked darkly that the Germans now danced to American tunes while they burned. Humor, brittle and defensive, cloaked their unease. By official count, the strike on Münster achieved moderate success, The rail yards were damaged but far from destroyed. Yet the mission was recorded quietly in archives as an operational anomaly, a warning carved into policy manuals under paragraphs few would ever read. The German intelligence division, meanwhile, preserved its own version under the heading Signalaufklärungserfolg durch Auslandsrundfunk. They enclosed transcripts of the intercepted melody, technical readouts, and triangulation charts. For them, it proved the enduring value of patient listening. Among the intercept operators, medals were modestly distributed, not for heroism, but precision. Yet even the recipients rarely spoke of it afterward. Listening to an enemy's music, they had glimpsed a vulnerability uncomfortably intimate. In both nations, reports were quietly shelved by spring 1944 as larger campaigns consumed attention. The war accelerated beyond individual errors into tides of vast destruction. The invasion of Normandy, the collapse of occupied Europe, and the concentration of Allied industrial might. Still, in the headquarters where communications officers gathered, the lesson endured in silence. One mistake, made not by pilots, but by the air itself, reminded both sides that control of the frequencies equaled control of the sky. Every broadcast thereafter, even those meant to soothe, carried a shadow. And across the ravaged fields of Germany, engineers rebuilt antennas among the ruins, not realizing that their work would form the foundation for an entirely new science born from those treacherous nights: electronic warfare. It was an age ending, yet not before it left one more haunting echo in the ledgers of history. By early 1944, both sides had drawn the same grim conclusion. Silence had to be weaponized. Every careless syllable, every flicker of a transmitter could invite catastrophe. Communication shifted from art to doctrine. In the United States and Britain, new schools of radio discipline sprang up overnight. Operators practiced in sealed rooms, reproducing the stress of real combat. They learned to speak in low tones and to ration every keying of the Morse paddle. "Transmissions kill," read a poster in one training bay. Crews repeated it the way sailors once repeated prayers. The haunting story of the night, a song betrayed bombers, was whispered through those courses as unofficial scripture. The incident had become folklore, a cautionary parable told to every incoming radio man. The technological transformation that followed was swift and uncompromising. Engineers developed crystal-locked frequency governors to prevent atmospheric drift. Tuners were rebuilt to minimize harmonic overlap. Broadcast schedules separated entertainment from operational wavelengths by wider margins than ever before. The light-hearted spontaneity of wartime radio programming, that essence of music over static, yielded to method. The airwaves grew colder, precise but joyless. For the Germans, victory in that small battle meant little against the weight of coming defeat. By mid-1944, the Reich's night fighter network was collapsing under Allied overload. Radar jamming by window chaff rendered their screens nearly blind. Advanced Allied countermeasures, H-2S mapping radar, and oboe pathfinder systems outpaced German adaptation. Intelligence celebrated the interception that had turned music into a weapon, but the scale of war soon dwarfed such triumphs. Their listening posts still functioned, but broader chaos drowned their sensitivity. Still, the moral undertone persisted. Officers who had been present that December night spoke afterward of the uncanny symbolism, how the instruments meant to bring morale became accomplices to destruction. One Luftwaffe controller wrote privately in 1945, as Allied troops closed on Berlin, that he still heard the song when the line went quiet, like a ghost between the frequencies. For him, victory had contained something too human to celebrate. The Allied command never released public acknowledgement during wartime. To reveal that music could destroy would undermine morale, which was itself a weapon. Yet traces appeared in post-war memoranda and intelligence summaries, categorized blandly as irregular radio propagation consequences. The facts remained secret until historians pieced them together from technical logs decades later. After the war, many of the scientists from both sides helped establish the frameworks that defined modern electronic warfare and air defense. The lesson of that night lived in their blueprints. The insistence that security in the age of invisible waves depends as much on restraint as on innovation. Radar warning receivers, secure multiplexed frequencies, coded bursts instead of open channels. Every innovation answered the same fear, that the air might once again decide to turn music into signal. The cultural echo outlasted the military one. Veterans of the 8th Air Force avoided discussing the incident, but some confessed decades later that they could never listen to swing music without unease. It had once represented laughter and youth. Now for them, it carried the smell of cordite and frozen air. Historians analyzing Allied broadcasting found no greater accidental tragedy within wartime communications. One misaligned dial, one patch of cold air, cost a squadron. Yet it also revealed the sheer fragility of 20th-century warfare. Conflicts fought not only with bombs and steel, but also with fragile streams of electrons humming over the horizon. When Germany finally fell, archives of both Allies and Axis filled with reels of intercepted sound, coded bursts, voice fragments, weather reports, and fragments of melody. Engineers listened with the detached ears of researchers. But for those who had been there, the sound meant something deeper. It spoke of the moment when the infinite power of connection turned briefly into a curse. By 1945, the airwaves were silent once more. Radio stations returned to a peacetime rhythm, broadcasting songs unmonitored by radar or fear. Yet for anyone who remembered the winter night when music became a map, the silence after those transmissions felt almost sacred. The first peaceful static after years of deadly noise. And through that silence, the next chapter of human warfare was preparing to be written, one defined by the hum of machines listening for mistakes. History rarely records the accidents. It prefers the plans, the orders, and the great victories that carry intent. But war is not a series of plans. It is a symphony of errors, some trivial, some catastrophic, all human. The night a swing melody wandered into the clouds above Germany stands as one of those moments where the smallest misalignment revealed the true intimacy of modern conflict. The episode reminds us that the Second World War was not only a battle of steel and bravery but also of invisible music, the hum of circuits and the heartbeat, transmitted across distance. Every side depended on the ether, that unseen ocean binding continents. Into it went courage, fear, and longing. Out of it came directions, deceptions, and sometimes death. In that December darkness, technology showed its dual nature. The same waves that carried the sound of home also carried betrayal. Each note of that lost song marked the collision of two eras, the sentimental human world that still dreamed of melodies and the emergent machine world where silence could kill and sound could signal annihilation. When German operators heard the American tune drifting through static, they were not wrong to feel wonder alongside duty. In an instant the enemy had become human, his joy and fragility laid bare through art. It was a revelation neither side desired. Music, the most universal expression of peace, had echoed as a coordinate of war. After the guns fell quiet, when veterans built the post-war world of global communication and broadcast, that memory lingered unseen beneath the optimism. It shaped the cautious architecture of modern transmission and the obsession with secure channels and filtered signals. The static that followed spoke of lessons learned the hardest way possible. Today, when a song drifts across continents without interference, it carries a trace of that winter night, when men on both sides paused, listened, and realized that even beauty can betray. In the great ledger of World War II, it is a small entry, almost lost among greater tragedies, but it endures as a whisper, that in the age of machines, peace remains only as strong as our discipline to keep the frequencies clear. Frozen music, fleeting signal, mortal consequence. One song heard by enemies alike, reminding humanity what it risks when it forgets to listen.